Yeah, hi, this is Joe Curto. We're going to do a little tutorial on SU float bowls. There's going to be some other ones for float bowl covers, but right now I think that I just want to deal with the float bowls themselves. Now, there's various versions of SU carburetors. The earliest style is what's called an H-type, which pre-war could have been also referred to as an HV or an OM, that sort of stuff. Basically, it's the carburetor that has all the cork seals and the brass arms in this area here. This happens to be an H6, that's an inch and three quarter, and this particular one is from an XK120. You see, this front area is where the jet would be. The back area would be where the float bowl mounts. Um, the they used this type of carburetor up until say 1962 or 63, which was in your MGAs. If you go from the MGA backwards, it covered Austin Healey hundreds. It covered T series cars, uh, Jaguars, XKs, Mark 7s, that sort of stuff. And then pre-war was pretty much everything. This was the style of carburetor. Uh, there are multiple float chambers that could have been used. Now, this set, okay, a 3496, and the other one is a 3495. Now, those are right hand, left hand float bowls that will sit on the carburetor at a 20-degree angle. Now, this is pretty much your most common. This will cover MGAs, T Series cars, TR3s, because they use two float bowls that face forward, have two of these on it. MGAs, which have the bowl at the radiator and at the firewall, they have a front and a rear. This'll go, and if it was on 104, which is on the opposite side of the engine, then they go front and rear reverse. But either way, this is what's called this is a 20-degree bowl for an H-type carburetor. Now, another quick indicator that you've got an H-type is it has this center stud that the float rides up and down on. Now, this is the float that you're normally seeing, which is a brass one, and that'll ride up and down and come up and make contact with the float fork. There are different size ones. This particular size carburetor is called a T2 carburetor. That refers to the size of this opening here. There are smaller ones, which is this, and this is called a T1 float bowl. I'll get back to the angles later. And then lastly is this monster, which is called a T4. I don't know where T3 went to, but it's T1, T2, T4. And then they have corresponding floats that go along with it. Back to the float chambers again. These bowls sit at a 20-degree angle. I'm going to park them here. Now, this is for like an XK120 that mounts flat. You see? So this is how that mounts. That's for a carburetor, and there's our technical inspector Cookie. This mounts here like this, and the carburetor sits at a 90 degrees off the cylinder head. All right, Cookie. Thank you. But now there's a wrinkle, as always is with this stuff. This is a 1208 bowl, It's made for, I can't read it there, but it's a 1208, and this sits on what's called a horizontal carburetor, flat carburetor. Now this is a 3062. This thing fits an SU called a downdraft carburetor. Now, if you can imagine, everybody's used to seeing SUs this way or this way. This one sits this way, like a little Chevy carburetor, and then the float bowl mounts. They have a different boss here, and the float bowl mounts. But why I say this, and you won't see much of it here in this country, but if you were in the UK, where at flea markets, you would probably find this float bowl. And the difference is, even though they look the same and the arms are flat, thank you, Cookie. The difference is in the height of this arm to this cover. Now, if you look here, if I put that against that straight edge and that straight edge, you see the difference where my pinky is pointing? So now if you used this float bowl onto an XK120, it's going to sit higher on the body, and you're going to have like a chronic rich running condition, because what happens with all of this float bowl stuff is, if you imagine the bowl as being like a coffee urn and the jet being the sight gauge, the higher you put the liquid in the coffee urn, in the urn, the higher it's going to be in the sight gauge. So what's going to happen is, if you use this bowl on this carburetor, just all you've got to do is turn the key on, and the gas will just come dribbling out, because the gas is going to be higher here. So I only warn you about this. You don't really see too many downdraft carburetors here in this country, though MGSAs use them. That's pre-war MG 6-cylinder. There were some Wolseleys and some other cars. So, it's the type of thing that if you're rummaging at the flea market and you see this, this bowl, you want to use, if you're doing like an XK120 or the early Austin Healey that had the 6-cylinder with the H4s on it, you want to use a 1208. Otherwise, you'll have a chronic rich running condition. Subsequently, if you use a 1208 bowl onto a downdraft carburetor, you'll have a chronic lean condition, because the bowl is sitting lower on the carburetor. Now, another variation of this carburetor is this, and this is got a T2 float chamber with a starting carburetor built into it. Now, this unit would be comparable to the 1208, and this particular unit would have been used on an XK120, Mark V, Mark IVs, SS cars, and it goes back into pre-war. And there are also versions of this. This one's a 3256. There's a 3258. Quite frankly, I'm not quite sure what the differences are, because the dimensions that we would be considered to be critical seem to all be the same. There are ones, different numbers, where this pipe comes up from the bottom. There are ones where it comes out the back, so that's part of the numbering system. The other carburetor or the other float bowl is this. Now, this is a 4815, and it sits at 30 degrees. So it's different. It's different than the 20-degree one. Now, there is a mate to it, a 4814, but that's super hard to find. This 4815 would be used on like Morris Miners with single carburetor installations. The 4814 shows up. There was a competition Mini that used H4s that had a 4815 and a 4814. So 4815s we can find, 4814s are, you know, tougher to find. So if you do find them, hang on to them, but they're also not interchangeable with the 3495 or 3496, which are 20 degrees. Now, up to this one, this is the T4 chamber. This would have been used on 2-inch sandcast carburetors, which were on C-type Jaguars and were optional on 120s and 140s. They also used this size bowl pre-war on supercharger installations and other heavy fuel requirement units. This one happens to be a reproduction. It has the SU logo on it. It's made by Berlin over in England, in the UK. Original ones would have been not a pebble finish. It would have been more of a finish like this, and they wouldn't have said SU on it. Now this float chamber takes floats that are. This is a new material called Nitrofill. This one's made by Berlin. They market it under the name Stay Up, and it's a black plastic foam that's impervious to ethanol in the fuel and modern chemicals in the fuel. These are the old brass floats. Now we've had versions of these that were kind of heavy. This one weighs 67.5 grams, and this is one of the ones that are a little on the heavy side. So a normal one would be about 58 grams, and it floats higher in the float chamber. If you use this on your 120, 140 C type, it being heavy, it'll stay down as if there's gas in it, and you would possibly wind up with a chronic rich running condition. So this is the better float, unless you find an original float brass that you want to use. This carburetor float bowl also would have been used on pre-war Bentleys, supercharger installations, that sort of stuff. Now, the last of this H-type float bowl, and we don't have too many samples of it, is what's called a bottom feed bowl. Now, this bowl mounts on the carburetor. The gas comes in at the bottom, and it comes out that jet. Now, what happens, and again, I don't have 100% matching stuff, but you'll get the idea. So this float comes up and comes and hits these toggles. And as it's hitting these toggles, it's pushing this needle down into the jet to shut it off. So you need a special float that has this concave dish in here, because the toggles are going to sit on the flat, and they need this dimpling in here to clear these screws. Now, these pedestals, sorry. Now, these float bowls are kind of a pain in the neck to set the float level, because what you've got to do is hook them up, fill them up with gas, take the cover off. Well, you fill them up with gas, look into the jet and see if it's higher or lower than the jet. If it's higher, you've got to add some shims under this float needle, under this float jet, or you've got to subtract some of these shims. So it's time consuming. It can be done. We've done it before, but they're just another, obviously not a popular idea, because this didn't go past maybe the 20s and mid 30s. So then that's when they went to the conventional float bowl that we pretty much know about. Again, this is And other cars used, I mean, there were American carburetors that used a bottom feed bowl. You'll see that from cars in the 20s, that sort of stuff. Now, moving along, the other float chambers, now these are what's called a T1, and that has to do with this size here, and that's the float for that. We also have these in the stay up, the nitrofill material. We just don't have any right now. They again do. There's a 20-degree bowl. That's this 8402 and 8403, and these would be used like on a Bug Eye Sprite. This is a 1216, which is a vertical bowl, and this would be on other, single carb installation type of thing. There is also this one, which is a 4961, again, 30 degrees. You can see the steep angle, but I could not find a reference to an opposite side one. So I guess that they only made this, and this would have been maybe on a Morris Minor. They surprisingly enough, some of the cars, some of the I believe the magnets, like the Farina bodied ones, used an 1.5-inch carburetor, but with these tiny float bowls. Why they did it, I don't know. So that's, again, these are called T1. And then the next type of float bowl, and these are not H-type, but these are HDs. But